it is my great pleasure to introduce two people that I know well, in fact. So Monica Franco Santos, who some of you also know. Monica is one of the team at Cranfield. She's a reader in organisational governance. I'll admit, Monica, I did actually have to look up what your title was, even though I've worked with you for so long. But she is a reader in organisational governance. And as I know her, really an expert in performance management and the implementation of HR systems. So that's why she's here today. And then also speaking with Monica is Daniel Alonso, who I know as one of our doctoral researchers at Cranfield, but has just taken up a role as the Global VP of Organisation and Rewards. You can see I'm having to read that as it's brand new in the Radisson Hotel Group. So they're going to talk about some research that they've been doing around performance management during the coronavirus pandemic. And you can see on the slides, of course, that they've done this also with a couple of colleagues. So not to forget them today. And with that note, I will stop taking their time and pass on to Monica and Daniel. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you very much. Daniel is going to...
Yes, thanks very much, Emma, and thank you very much, Monica, and welcome everyone to this webinar. And thank you for the interest in the topic, which has been a fascinating ride for us during 2020 as the pandemic broke. And as Emma was saying, Monica and I will be presenting today, but the outcome that you're going to see, the insights that you're going to see today are the work of two other people as well, Germán Céspedes in Mexico and Pilar Rivera in Zaragoza in Spain. And I say hello to them from here. And thanks again for them for the contributions to the team and the outcome that we're going to share with you today. So we were very interested at looking at how the pandemic had affected or was affecting the way leaders managed performance in teams. And you probably have been reading and listening to a lot of stuff happening around the pandemic and how pandemic has affected different things, particularly in organizations. And it is true that an event like a pandemic is like sometimes flicking us a light in a dark room. It allows us to see things that we didn't see before. And in that sense, we were really interested and wanted to see how in the immediate effects of the pandemic, because this is something that we started a year ago when the pandemic broke out, how were leaders adapting their performance management to the new environment? So the first thing that we noticed is that there was an unplanned and sudden change in the location of people. So without managers approving or organizations making big decisions around remote working, it was simply imposed on people. So it was unplanned, sudden, and widespread. And we noticed and we started seeing that managers in leading teams and wanting to ensure that work actually got done were getting quite anxious about it. And whereas in the past, perhaps they were walking around the corridor, looking at people and their desks, seeing that they were clocking in at 8 a.m. in the morning, now they were sitting at home wondering how that father of three was dealing with the kids at home and whether they were putting in the hours or not. And so we started noticing some behaviors and we're interested in looking at how those adjustments were affecting the way the performance management was taking place in the teams, but also what impact that had then on the team performance, on the well-being as well of the individuals in the teams. The second thing that was happening was disruption and uncertainty. And of course, here we're looking at and talking to some of the leaders in this process, and they were telling us how at the beginning, perhaps they were feeling much more anxious about the change and whether we're going to hit the numbers, etc. And of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, no one knew how long it was going to last. So we weren't sure it was going to last a year, a month, 5 years. And so there was a lot of uncertainty and managers were having to deal with that. From an employee level as well, there was anxiety and illness, something that now it's become much more apparent and companies have become much more active in managing the well-being. But also there was social distancing and work-life imbalance. And we all laughed at videos of broadcasters trying to go on TV with children and cats around. So a lot was happening during the pandemic, and we were asking ourselves, how was leadership adapting performance management, and how was that shift affecting teams' morale, well-being, and ultimately performance? So So if we go to the next slide. So what we started noticing is that the managers were actually changing the way that they were controlling their teams. And control, when you come at control from a practitioner's perspective, not so much an academic perspective, it's quite an ugly word. And when interviewing people for the study, no one really was admitting that they control their teams. Everyone said, no, I don't control my team, or I haven't changed the way I control my team. But then when you were putting the finger on it, they were indeed, doing micro controls, like putting up, and maybe some of you have experiences, putting up team meetings on Mondays at 8 a.m., checking on their Skype activities on their teams, and making sure that people were connecting on a Friday afternoon and not going off to the countryside or something. So although perhaps they weren't talking about control in that way, they were indeed introducing those little items of control in their day-to-day management. So what we started seeing is that the control element was changing, and managers were perhaps replacing the visual controls in the office for other more technology-enabled, let's say, controls in the virtual world. And so we were interested at seeing how the balance of that new set of controls was affecting trust in the teams. And when you look at these two items, control and trust in businesses, typically we look at them separately, and we look at them as two different things. When we look at controls and when teams work on control, we mostly do it looking at things like objective setting, performance management, end of year appraisals. So we control when we look at the budget number and we say, have you achieved it or not? Or when we agree a monitoring process. And that is what in business we look at as control. And that is this typically associated with, we could call it hard elements of management: objective setting, metrics, targets, appraisals. When teams work on trust, they work on things like open communication, psychological safety. You look at trust in the context of leadership. You look at trust in the context of team effectiveness. And indeed, most of the models around team effectiveness have a foundational element of trust in them. If you look at the 5 dysfunctions of a team of Lencioni, the first building block, for example, is trust, talks about vulnerability. You look at things like non-violent communication models to work on trust within teams. And so as teams work on trust and control, they look at them almost, or you work on them almost as two separate things. And perhaps in the mind of leaders, in the mind of employees, we consider them as separate. On the one hand, you have the hard stuff of control, performance management, objectives, etc., budgets. On the other hand, you have the soft elements of trust. Right? We look at objectives and KPIs on the one hand, and we build relationships and connections on the other. However, when you start looking at trust and control, the reality is that they are inextricably interconnected. They depend on each other, they affect each other, and they are very intimately connected. And as a practitioner, that in itself is an insight, because although we treat them as separate things and we bucket them differently, they are actually very connected. So if we go to the next slide, they are connected in different ways. And we know a number of things from research on the trust-control relationship. And for those of you who are not in the academic world, there is a big body of literature in the trust control literature. And if you ever want to get into it, there's quite a lot to get your teeth into. So what do we know about it? The first thing that we know is that both trust and control are performance management mechanisms. So leaders, organizations can use both trust and control to ensure they achieve their performance goals. Leaders can build trust relationships, open, candid, vulnerable communication that helps teams achieve their goals. Leaders can also set clear objectives, monitor them, manage them actively, and make sure that teams achieve their goals. Both are performance management mechanisms. The second thing that we know from the literature and from the research is that they can actually play together differently. So sometimes they complement each other. And you can see there the picture of the, I don't know whether that's butter and jam, or peanut butter and jam, or marmalade, I don't really know. But that's the idea there, is that you can put one on top of the other and it will help. So you have a control mechanism, like, for example, objective setting, and perhaps you build open communications within the team. And what that trust activity that you're doing is complementing the performance management that you have put in place. So that's sometimes trust and control act as complementary. Sometimes, however, they act as substitutes. So sometimes when you are building a relationship of trust within a team and you have open communications, you dial up control mechanisms. And what that does is that it actually dials down trust. So you start controlling people more, and the effect that has on the trust in the team is that it lowers the trust. And so it can act in one or the other way. It could be that by changing the way that we control our teams, we could be lifting up trust, we could be creating a more trusting environment, or by dialing up control, we could be hurting the trust relationship that we had built in the team. So this made our research particularly interested in the terms of pandemic, because we were seeing that managers indeed were dialing up control, driven perhaps by the anxiety of the uncertainty, etc. And we were interested in seeing what effect has that had on the team's trust. So another thing that we know from the literature that was also quite important as a context to our research was that the relationship between trust and control is key for explaining how organizations respond to extreme events. So when faced with a tsunami or a big financial crisis, how the trust control relationship within teams or within organizations behave, how each feeds on each other, etc., is critical to explain how able an organization is to overcome the extreme event. So we found that there is a problem with control and trust in extreme events. And if you click through, Monica, just to reveal the text, extreme events do create disruptive contexts. So we actually, when faced with COVID at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know, and managers didn't know, whether actually the objectives that we had set at the beginning of the year were relevant anymore. Whether the metrics, the budget that had been approved in January or December or November was any more relevant. Was it going to be a 1 month thing and we're going to skip over the month and pick it up where we were, or was it going to be longer and disrupt completely an industry? So that uncertainty meant that the mathematics of control started being less reasonable. And so extreme event creates disruptive contexts that need flexibility. You need to adapt, because you can't hold on to something rigid when things are shaking around you. And so it needs flexibility, it needs learning and collaboration within the teams. Now, when we look at the economics research and the economists, they look at control and trust in a certain way, in extreme circumstances. What they say is that traditional controls are insufficient or deficient, and they need to be balanced with trust. So the way that economists look at this is they say that you have a set of control mechanisms. What you have to do as a leader when you're hit by an event like this is you have to add trust on top. So trust becomes additive, right? However, when you look at further research, if you go to the next bullet, looking at hurricanes, financial crisis, etc., that shows that controls actually create unintended consequences. So it's better to focus on trust. So what this other research is telling us is that when things like hurricanes or financial crisis happens, or COVID happens, actually the opposite is true, that what you have to do is to replace control by trust. So forget your old ways of controlling because they're not valid anymore, or at least partially, and focus on building a trusting relationship with your teams. So with all of this as a context, at the beginning of last year, we're sitting there asking us three key questions. And that's the three questions that the research that we conducted was aiming to answer. So the first one is, what are managers doing in terms of trust and control? Very simple question. So we're hit by something like COVID, unexpected. People start working from home with cats, dogs, children, parents, the 9 to 5 off the window, etc. What did managers do in terms of trust and control? Did they immediately or naturally dial up trust and stepped away from control measures? Did they dial up control and mistrusted people because they weren't sure whether people were going to respond, or did they dial up both? What did they do? The second question was, under the circumstances created by COVID-19, were trust and controls at a team level substitutes or complements? So when we were dialing up control, was that helping trust or was it replacing trust? And then the third question, which in a way looks at the consequence of all of this, is saying, how is a controlled trust relationship therefore influencing team performance and individual well-being at the outset of a pandemic? So the pandemic breaks out, leaders dial up trust, control, whatever it is they're doing, and then ultimately, how does that affect performance and individual well-being? So with these three questions in mind, we set up a study and a set of interviews. And Monica, I invite you now to present the outcome of the study and a bit of the background of the survey itself.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So what did we do in order to address these questions? Well, we basically did three key things. So first one was just look at the literature and what could we learn from previous research on both the balance between trust and control, but also what happens in extreme events. So as Daniel mentioned, looking at what managers, what organizations did when facing things such as hurricanes, financial crisis, and multiple other different devastations like natural disasters. So because obviously we didn't really have a lot of evidence on other pandemics apart from the one in 1918. So we looked at what we could find both in the academic literature but also in the practitioner literatures. Then we also interview people, managers in different countries and see how they were experiencing the pandemic in Spain, Mexico, UK, and Sweden. And from that, we created a survey. And we wanted to concentrate on one single population. So in order to understand better what was going on. So and be able to control more the responses and the insights that we could get in order to see if we could extrapolate the insights. So we concentrated in Mexico. We had more access there, not only to managers, executive MBAs that were working and facing the pandemic, but also we could have access to some of their individuals in their teams. So we could see both perspectives. So we had the perspective of the manager, but also the perspective of their team members. So we were able to create a sample frame with 657 exec MBAs on their teams, and then we got a response of 452. With that, what did we find? So we could see that the combination overall through the interviews and with the survey, when the pandemic struck, what we found was that managerial perceptions about a sense of higher risk and higher uncertainty, together with the belief that people, when working remotely, were going to reduce their efforts, perhaps because they were not being supervised, then there was a natural tendency as a whole to increase a focus on results, mainly KPIs and the previous targets that they had before the pandemic. And I'll go into the detail of the things that I'm going to mention as key findings in a minute. So they basically dialed up on the outcome control by focusing more on measures and targets, things that they could get them a feeling of being in control, although they were not necessarily. They also, because they couldn't have the visual opportunity of understand what their people were doing, they introduced new behavioral controls. So what Daniel mentioned as using technology to check up on what people were doing, they were introducing new ways of understanding what was going on, unplanned meetings as well as planned meetings, which led us also to see how communication went up, not only to control, but also to balance trust. So communication happened in two different ways, sometimes in a formal way to check that things were happening and how results were emerging. But at the same time, in many situations, there were informal ways of communicating, not only to check what was going on, but also how people were feeling. And that had an effect on trust as well. So they were increasing results control and new ways of monitoring people, although they were saying that they were not necessarily doing that, but the data shows that they were. And at the same time, they were also trying to balance that out by introducing informal ways in which to pay attention to the different situations that people were going through and try to accommodate their emphasis on results accordingly. We also saw that there was a differentiated approach, but that was not necessarily across the board. So we saw that there were many managers didn't necessarily differentiate according to individual circumstances, whilst the reduced set did. So taking on board what people were going through in their balance of how performance was occurring and how much they were able to do realistically. Let me go quickly into each of those key findings. So in terms of emphasis on outcome control, so people unable to visually control what people were doing, they had a natural tendency, like I said, to focus on metrics and develop and the targets without realizing or being aware of, obviously these were not necessarily good measures according to the circumstances that were happening, but that was the only thing that they had to hold on to. And in a way that was felt by employees in terms of how ill-defined they appeared to be according to the circumstances, but still it seems that on a whole, the majority of the people that we talked to, and based on the things that they responded in the text of the survey, they were still focusing on metrics and the targets that they had before the pandemic. Then they also introduced new behavioral controls when the monitoring the visual clues disappeared, like what we just said, finding new ways and alternative ways, sometimes informally. And this was also to trying to balance what they thought that the relationships of trust that they had before the pandemic, trying to understand and find information to either double check that what their views or perceptions that they have of the people before the pandemic were able to continue, even if they were working remotely from home. So instantly at the very beginning, managers tried to check on whether the thoughts they had about how people worked before in their office were also constant when they were working remotely. So as a way of double checking that people could be trusted. And which had all this, the dialing up of focus on results and KPIs and targets, together with these new alternative informal ways of monitoring employees, had an interesting effect on how employees perceived the whole situation. So when they perceived that managers had good intentions held at heart in a way that even though the pressure on results, knowing that perhaps the KPIs were no longer that useful according to the situations, and that the targets perhaps were not, again, as accurate, if they could feel that the focus was trying to help them. So it came with an intention to help and support. Actually, they didn't really see it as a negative thing. However, when these perceptions of increased control were not felt to be having a good intention at heart, then automatically that damaged trust and eventually affected their well-being. So, and this was also, let me go quickly on this. So things about, especially when managers didn't take into consideration the individual personal situations, which obviously were very different to the ones that were in place, the ones that were taken into account when setting up the performance indicators and the targets before the pandemic struck. So there were managers that were able to understand the new situation, the individual situation, and adapt to it and try to experiment new ways. But others didn't necessarily accommodate for individual situations, and employees perceived that. And obviously that affected the way they perceived their managers. So within that, how transparent managers were in terms of how they were accommodating the different approaches was also perceived as important. And one thing that we found that was quite interesting was that previous biases about whether someone was a high performer individual or a low performer individual carry on and even increased whilst working remotely. So if you thought that employee A was a high achiever before the pandemic, when these people were working remotely, those biases towards either one that is perceived to be high performer or one that is perceived to be a very low performer, they increased. So those biases became even bigger. So if you were considered a poor performer, you all of a sudden it was even worse than before. So that affected perceptions. So perceptions overall came out as being really, really important. So how people perceive the actions, perhaps because through technology, you're not able to double check. Now, we tried to also test through the survey all these relationships. So we were wanting to know, is it what we're seeing that trust is increasing? Sorry, control has increased, and under some situations, it has damaged trust. And that may be having a negative effect on well-being and performance. Can we test that through the data? So I'm going to go quickly on the stats here, but basically we found that exactly is what was happening. So under extreme circumstances, the natural tendency is to dial up control because managers perhaps feel that lack of being in control. So automatically they focus on key outcome results / KPIs, targets that were designed, even if they were designed before the pandemic, and introduce new ways of monitoring. If that is not done with care, automatically that affects people's perceptions of their managers and affects the relationships, affects the trust. So basically control goes up, trust goes down. And that lack of trust, or perceptions of lack of trust, automatically affect their well-being, which eventually, so it increases their stress levels and it decreases their vitality as we measured it. And however, we were unable to really see if that has an effect on performance. So we were able, perhaps because it was a cross-sectional piece of research, there is some time lag between we perceive or we see in the data that people's well-being have been negatively affected, and that feeling of reduced well-being has an effect on their performance. So although in our data we found a negative coefficient in terms of performance, it wasn't significant. So basically, we cannot really say much about how that unbalanced, that high control, low trust affected the overall team performance. So on that, we need to do more research on that aspect. And I'm going to pass it on to Daniel, who is going to highlight key recommendations. So what can we do to learn from this and try to avoid the problems that we're finding? Daniel, you have your mic on. Yeah.
Yeah, someone was telling me that "you are a mute" was the most said sentence last year. So here we are. I was muted. Yeah, thank you, Monica. So as you can see, that the results from our survey was indicating that indeed managers had a natural tendency to dial up a little bit control, and that it had a substitute effect on trust. And so the first thing in terms of a recommendation that comes out from the data is that just be aware of that. Just be aware that trust and control are two things that perhaps in businesses are looked at separately, but they affect each other. The moment that you dial up one, the other one would be affected. And in the context of something like a pandemic, or in the context of a big change, they replace each other. So when you dial up trust, if you're not careful, it will replace trust. As Monica was saying, that has to do significantly with perception. So at the end, if an employee has you have a call at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning set up by your manager, if you think that that call is there to help you, then perhaps it will have no negative effect or even a positive effect on trust. However, if you think that the call is there so that your manager is comfortable that you're up, awake, and showered at 8 a.m., then it's going to have a negative effect on trust. So the perception around this obviously is quite important. But the first recommendation as a leader, just be aware that they are substitute in circumstances like the ones we're living through. The second thing is around encouraging learning, reflection, and collaboration. And what we saw in some of the interviews as well was that leaders that reached out to their teams and ensured collaboration happen, and they tested things out with the teams, etc., were the managers that got to a trusting environment again more quickly. So encourage learning and encourage reflection. Many of these things are related to team resiliency. For those of you who have studied it, you will bounce back more quickly. The third item is to accept rather than ignore uncertainty. And many of the things that we were seeing in the interviews and many of the leaders that we were talking to were acknowledging that part of their initial reaction was driven simply by uncertainty. They were themselves at home, they had people at home, they didn't know what was going on, they weren't sure their KPIs were useful anymore. And so accept them, deal with them, but also observe yourself how you are dealing with that uncertainty. What is it that the uncertainty is driving you to do as a leader? Are you dialing as a consequence controls up? So if uncertainty is a driver of your controls, then just watch out, you may be having a negative effect on the trust that you're building with your team. The fourth item that came out of the data was this idea of allowing yourself to experiment. And at the outset of the pandemic, no one had the answers. I certainly didn't, and I'm sure no one really had any of the answers, but we had to try out. So what we saw is that leaders that experimented and learned quickly from the experiment bounced back and got up on their feet more quickly. So allow yourself to experiment, try things out. The next thing is that if you have to keep looking at metrics and targets, and if you're a leader, the chances are you will continue looking at metrics and targets, make sure that you add qualitative information, narratives on performance, but also discretion. And when you look at many of the bonus plans that were modified midway through last year, a lot of them saw discretion added to them. Just an example of a control mechanism that resolved the uncertainties of the pandemic by adding a level of discretion. Transparency and communication, going back to the idea of trust, are key levers of trust. And then lastly, social interaction is paramount. So we saw that high trust teams, at least those that the managers defined as high trust teams, actually created the social interactions themselves. So many of the teams that the leaders were telling us about created those team gatherings, informal coffee after work, etc., just to make sure that they kept that level of relationship going. But if it doesn't happen, then, as one of the interviewers said, re-engineer or engineer social. That was literally her sentence: engineer social, as a tool that worked for her. So social interaction is paramount. And then the last point is around staying true to your leadership style. And this is something that we saw a bit of, which is that people who, through the pandemic, made a big switch on their leadership style struggled to then get back to a balance with their team. So try to make it to minimize disruption. Keep to your leadership style, your way of managing control and trust, or balancing them prior to the pandemic, and don't become someone completely different because of the change. So, as you can see, quite a lot of insights coming from the data. The main ones I would say: be aware of the trust control dynamic and how it works in situations like this. Check yourself on how you manage uncertainty, and make sure that the social element of the team is there if it's not naturally emerging. So with that, we left ourselves with some questions as well. By looking at the data, we also see that some additional knowledge is needed. So some further investigation is needed. So the first thing here is that we noticed that some of the teams, actually many of the teams through the pandemic, teamed up quite strongly and made a huge effort to reconnect and build those connections within the team in whatever ways they could. But it didn't happen as much with inter-team relationship. So I spent a lot of time on Teams with my direct team, but that team didn't work with the finance team or the logistics team that well. So new research, I think, is needed to look into how inter-teams relationships and the way of managing performance and trust and connections, etc., are affected by the pandemic. The second thing that needs some further study is how performance-related feedback is affected by these shifts. So when additional or alternative mechanics can be used to improve performance feedback quality, how are teams managing this, and how are leaders changing the way they provide feedback. And then the last one is around how perhaps in these conditions, teams choose to move from individual assessment of performance to team assessment of performance. And we saw a little bit of that in the interviews, but not enough to drive a conclusion. And that's something that we think is worthy of study, because indeed it could be that that's what many teams were doing, shifting from looking at individuals in isolation to looking at more team performance. And I'm sure other questions will emerge over time as we continue looking at the data and talking to leaders. But these were some of the main conclusions and recommendations, and the 3 key open questions that we were left with. I don't know, Monica, if you have additional recommendations to share or other questions that pop up in your mind.
No, I think I'm looking forward to hearing the questions from the group and perhaps their experience, to see if these insights resonate with them.
Brilliant. So I think we're going to open the Q&A, and you're welcome to unmute and ask a question, or just pop a question in the chat.
Monica and Daniel, I have a question that has come just to me in the chat. So perhaps if I can start off, but on behalf of somebody else.
Yep.
Although my chat has just moved, so let me just move back up the chat, because okay, so Salim, I think, asked Graham and now me the question. Does any part of the study address leadership and management style, for example, authentic leadership or otherwise? And just to add context to that, Salim is observing that managers saying, sorry, I'm reading here, so my apologies for that. Managers saying well-being is important, and that managers say well-being is important and they care, but then they don't show the same for various reasons, because of business needs, targets, etc. So they don't seem to do what they say. So I guess Salim is wondering on the importance of authentic leadership rather than just saying the right thing, I guess.
Yes. So we really good, both very good questions. So on the first one, we did not include leadership style as one of our key variables, although obviously when we were talking to the people, the set of interviews that we did, that was mentioned, that obviously the way people responded to their team had a lot to do with their leadership style. But perhaps because of that, perceptions here matter, and then the relationship between what you say and what you do are key. So if you're saying that you care about well-being, but then all you focus on are your KPIs and the targets that you set up 2 years ago now, so before the pandemic, then automatically, even if you're saying that you care, you're using the metrics in a way that are telling the people that you do, but metrics come first. So the business comes first. And this is what I think in an extreme circumstance like the one we're living right now, where people are putting their best to make things work, which is what we also saw in the extreme events literature. So under these extreme events, the fact that, or the belief that people slack or do not, or want to be lazy, actually do not apply. So people want to do what is best for the organization, because that ultimately is what is best for them. So when they see that managers are using metrics that are ill-defined for the situation, it upsets them more than anything else. This is why being aware of that, it's important. Also being aware of how much noise those metrics have. So even if you focus too much of them, it's not like you're going to get the performance, because the metrics is not useful. So it gives you the illusion of control, but it's not really good control. And with that, I'll stop.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that, and thanks for the question and thanks for the answer, Monica, that at the end, well-being or leaders' care for well-being is a perception. So we did obviously hear about managers telling us that they cared a lot for the teams. We didn't get to talk to the teams to see whether they experienced the care for their leaders, right? So at the end, we don't have that data, and as I was saying, whether I feel my manager cares for my well-being or not is my perception. What we did see is that indeed, when we dial up control, I'm hurt. You know, that's what this is. You know, in a way, delivering. So we have some questions coming up in the chat. Thanks everyone for the engagement. Nani saying that she brings up dancers on an ice rink. That's a nice visual. Nani says, sorry, I don't understand the reference made to discretion. Maybe lost in translation as an element to add to metrics beside qualitative data.
So discretion is subjectivity. So basically that if you cannot add a narrative, which is text coming together with the data, explaining the context and to what extent the data really reflects what is being observed on the ground. So you can use a narrative to complement the information that comes from the metric. But sometimes that may not be enough. So adding discretion is really adding subjectivity, in the sense that the manager may be gathering evidence from multiple different people are associated with one individual, and then making a judgment about where he or she thinks what the person has done is good or bad, or it can be able to rate. So that's what it means, discretion.
Thanks, Monica. There's another question here from David. Hi, David. Is there a correlation between corporate culture and our study? So he's mentioning cultures high on control or high on trust, and how can that affect our results?
Another great question. We were unable to include all the items to assess culture, so I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that. Yeah,
I think we were looking mostly at team dynamics. So we're trying to look at how a leader's reaction to the pandemic affected the trust control relationship in the team. Yeah, and we didn't have that visibility of company. We have here a question from Phil. From what you have read in the media in the last 2 days, where do you think KPMG went wrong? And actually, I haven't read much other than the fact that the CEO resigned over a comment over COVID. I actually don't have a lot of detail. I don't know, Monica, if you have more.
Well, basically, I think with that comment, he was sending a signal that let's concentrate on the business and, in a way, ignore the experiences that people on the ground are having, dealing with all the constraints and the difficulties, and sometimes also health issues of their loved ones. So obviously, it's like showing little compassion, and the effect that it has had actually tells you that matters under extreme circumstances, not showing compassion.
Okay, we have here questions around the impact of extreme events is clear from the research. Did the research look at impact of proximity, remoteness on the relationship between control and trust?
So that's a very interesting question. And I think in terms, because this is something that we perhaps haven't clarified enough in the presentation. What an extreme event highlights is that you not only have high risk, you also have high uncertainty. Sometimes when working remotely, it may just be that you have high risk, but not high uncertainty. So under high risk, complementing trust and control may work, because the lack of uncertainty, or at least when you cannot argue that the uncertainty has increased, your control mechanisms may still be valid, or at least more reliable than when you also have high uncertainty. So our insights about the substitution effect between trust and control really apply under extreme circumstances, meaning that you have both high risk and high uncertainty. So that affects the quality of the metrics, and also the importance that you have to pay to the people and their well-being.
There's another question here from Paul. To what extent did IT, I'm assuming here we mean systems, help or hinder? So to what extent technology, I guess, like Teams and Skype and Zoom, help or hinder?
That was the key thing that managers were using to communicate and try to double check on how much they can trust their people. So they use technology to be able to check, but also to show that they care. So I think, and this is then, it wasn't the purpose of our research, but I could speculate that it really helped.
Yeah, I mean, imagine having lived through that without the internet or mobile phones, in the analog world of faxes and letters and fixed line phones. Yeah. Oksana here raises something quite interesting. She says, no significant effect on performance, as we said. Could it be that is a true insight, that is, in extreme circumstances, it does not much matter whether the organization drives either trust or control, as long as everybody understands that the business comes first?
It could be. It could be. Although the fact that it had a negative effect on well-being, it's also an important thing. And nowadays, I think well-being should be at the top of the agenda as well as performance. So I think both of them go hand in hand.
I'm just having to run through some of the questions here. Salim asks a question around culture. So did we pick up anything on a different country culture, UK versus Sweden, Mexico, etc.? And are we planning to extend the study to include cultural dimensions like Hosfedes?
I guess here would be more with the interviews. I mean, Daniel, you definitely notice the difference between what people in Sweden said compared to people in Mexico. I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I mean, the first thing to note is that the countries were going at different speeds at the time of COVID. So when we were running the interviews in Spain, we were in complete panic whereas the Swedes were cruising it. You know, there were schools were open, offices were open. It wasn't an issue. So when looking at cultural differences, one of the problems is just understanding that each country was sitting in a different place. But I think that although perhaps the starting point of each of the teams was a bit different because of culture, the effects of control and trust and the effects of the change were the same.
Yep.
So perhaps they were starting from a different point, but the dynamics were the same, at least the ones we saw. But great question. Similar question from Alan. Do you think your results may have been different had you conducted your survey in an Asian country, such as Korea? Probably.
And actually, one of the key things we didn't mention, but we're trying to conduct this in India. So we would like to now gather some data in India and also in the UK, if I'm able to reach the exec MBAs here.
Yeah, I call for you if you're in the call. We want your help. So a comment here from Fiona. I have found that some of my weakest members of my team have actually become the strongest and have found a voice in the past year. So is this something that has been shown in your findings? And Monica, I think you were actually mentioning that we found, for the most part, and obviously this is a generalization, but for the most part, we find quite the opposite, that the remoteness exacerbated things. So if I had a favorite in my team, that became the favorite's favorite, you know, like it doubled up on things, and people, perhaps members of my team who I thought were not as great, suddenly I thought they were terrible. So our experience of it, of what we found, is actually the contrary, that it has exacerbated. But I can completely picture what you're saying, Fiona, that someone who perhaps in a more traditional setting in the office was more quiet, found a more comfortable space in remoteness and started to shine. So yeah, we didn't see it, but I can completely see it happening. Okay, I don't know how we're doing for time, Emma.
You've got time for probably one or two more questions if you want to answer them, Daniel and Monica. I think you've got 3 minutes left. So.
Okay, let me just say, Steve asking, do you think remote working has come to stay and the corporate world will need a different HR strategy?
That sounds like a question for me, but I'll let you answer.
Okay, we can give it a go, Emma, and then you can, on your closing, you can comment. So, I mean, I think absolutely yes. I think these webinars that Emma is leading and then putting together is a testament to, you know, business and academia trying to get together and wrapping our heads around what's going to happen and how can we best respond to it. And absolutely, I think remote working is here to stay. I think a lot of people who were resistant to remote working have realized that actually it's okay to let go, and now they're more relaxed. And many people are saying that COVID has become became the chief transformation officer in their companies, driving this technical change, and now we're there. So whether we'll take one step back before we continue moving forward, I don't know, but certainly it is coming to change. And most definitely, I think a change in the HR strategy will be required from a talent perspective, from a compensation perspective, you know, people sitting in different countries, moving around, sitting at home, etc. Absolutely, yes. It's going to be an exciting ride. Okay, we're going to go for one last one then. There's many questions coming through. Bill says, did you look at long-term game?
Could I just, Emma, is the end time fixed, or can we go over it? Being Spanish, I'm allowed to say
Yeah, exactly.
There's definitely a cultural difference there between between the UK and the kind of Germanic cultures and the Latin cultures that I'm seeing. Yeah. I think it's fine for you to go on for a few minutes, probably, even if if some people will obviously drop off, but.
Okay, of course.
I'm fine. I'm fine for a few minutes if that's the question. So
okay, people can drop off if not. If you're dropping off, thanks for joining us, and see you next time. Okay, Bill here is asking, did you look at long-term gain versus short-term gain approaches and business drivers and outlooks?
Not yet.
And we did not. I guess that's a short answer. No. I mean, it's a really interesting question and triggers other questions in my head, but no, we didn't.
Yeah,
Monica?
Yes.
This is David from Detroit. Can I throw out an observation?
Definitely.
Yeah. as I look through the presentation deck that you presented, all of you have done a wonderful, wonderful job on this. An observation is that what you've presented, in some ways, and please don't take this wrongly, it seems somewhat obvious. It's just that the circumstances of the pandemic have brought it to the forefront that for organizations to be successful, for managerial techniques and so forth that we've known for some years now that maybe haven't been employed as necessary. Now more than ever, those techniques are critical, and it kind of is forcing managers to put them on the forefront and make the rubber meet the road in order for organizations to be successful, for individuals to be successful, and for all of us to come together, right? So, some of the concepts, they're not new, it's just they've become very front and center now.
Yeah, for us, the key insight was that when people should be relying on trust and relationships and really going for the soft matters of management because the hard data is unreliable, actually what managers do is go right to the hard data. So they rely on the metrics and the targets, which is actually creating the unintended. So the things so it's damaging trust, which is what you require. So for us, that was the key insight. Although obviously to be able to justify it, we needed the evidence to show that. So
it seems to me that like the concept of emotional intelligence becomes more important than ever in this type of environment.
Absolutely. I think, David, great points. And I think that we mustn't forget that leaders themselves were going through a process of anxiety and sense making, and they were under their own pressures. So many of the reactions that we were picking up from leaders were coming from that point of uncertainty and anxiety.
And I would add something more. I think we are set up to work in very predictable organizations. So the rules, the routines, the behaviors that we accept, they work very well when things are stable. But that sometimes that enables us or limits us to then set free when things are not planned. So people seem to be reluctant to just drop the target because it's just not helping you. It's actually damaging. Just why do you keep on focusing on it? Drop it. But they were like, I cannot drop the target. It's like, well, why not? If the information is useless. So
yep. Thank you for letting me jump in.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the comments. We have here a question from Christina. Hi, Christina. Do you know why biases related to performance increased? And what can leaders learn from this to avoid it?
Nope, we don't know why it happened. But that was coming up in I don't know if Herman is in the room, because he was the one that really noticed that more, and it came up as something that the evidence from Mexico showed.
Yeah. Intuitively, what I think, Christina, is that in managers' assessment of the team, suddenly there was a vacuum. So whereas they used to walk around the office and they had a sense of how people were doing, suddenly they didn't have that, and managers were looking for ways in which to fill that vacuum. And so existing biases, I think, was one of the things they could use to fill that vacuum, if you want. I think that's it's emerging from that need from managers to have data to assess their team. But that's just a guess. We didn't actually get to the bottom of that. So since we don't know why, we can't really help or tell them what to learn from it, other than to watch out that this is a dynamic that is created in these circumstances. So when you're under stress or pressure on these exceptional situations, it may be that you're exacerbated in your biases, and just watch out for it. Okay, we have here a practical question. Could it be shared afterwards to aid reflection? I'll let you comment on that, Emma, if the slides are going to be shared.
Yes, if you two we've had a few questions about the slides being shared. Actually, if you two are happy for me to share the slides, then we can certainly do that. We will also make the recording of this webinar available both on the Cranfield YouTube channel and on the Changing World of Work website. So you will be able to log in and see the whole thing again if you want to.
Brilliant.
Or pass it on to your colleagues. So, you know,
Great. We have one last question if we all have. Yeah, so it's from Marcin Stefaneski. Hello. Any notable examples of the experimental approach some managers took? I think this refers to this notion of managers experimenting with things. And nothing revolutionary, Martin. I'm sorry, there was nothing magical coming up other than just trying things out. I don't know, Monica, you remember anything specifically?
Well, they were with the different sort of meetings, Monday meetings, coffee things, cocktail meetings, game meetings. There were all sorts of meetings trying to get people together and to interact. So all those were experiments. So some of them seem to work well, some of them seem to not go where only work for some time, and then they had to keep on reinventing
Right.
what they did.
I'll tell you, Monica, that and Martin, the difference really we saw is not so much what they tried, because at the end we all tried different things, but more the fact that some leaders were more attuned to how their teams reacted, and that's what made the difference. So there were some that tried some things out, and they were really tuned into how the team were experiencing it, how they were understanding the control, whether they were understanding it as something that was there to help them or something that was there to monitor them. And so leaders that were attuned to that feedback and were listening to it were the ones that were actually leveraging the experimentation and taking steps to correct it and get to a better place. So it's more around how they listened than what they tried.
Within let me add one more thing. Within that experimentation, there was maybe an anecdote of something that a CEO in not necessarily a big company in Mexico did. After everyone was sent home, he decided to book some lorries with all the chairs from the offices and send those chairs to every single one of the individuals that worked for him. So things like that apparently paid off completely, because people felt that, I mean, he is taking care of us. So, and I'm not really sure about the quality of the chairs, but just the act of getting all these chairs in the truck and off to your house, so was amazingly perceived.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to close. Emma,
Brilliant.
thanks everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, Monica.
Thank you very much. Monica, can I have my other slide up by any chance, or do you want me to share it?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Just so that I can do, but just to say, first of all, why Monica's doing that, just to say thank you so much to both Daniel and Monica and the team for what I think is a fascinating piece of research. And by the number of questions and comments and the fact that we still have, 50 people here 10 minutes after we were due to end, I think shows, really shows that people are engaged and interested in this topic. So thank you to both of you for a fantastic webinar. It's just left for me to say, as I said at the beginning, this is part of a series from the Changing World of Work group. So just to give you a bit of a trailer for our next one, our next webinar is on the 8th of March, and I'm delighted to introduce a friend of the Changing World of Work group, Paula Leach. Some of you may know her. She's been in a number of chief people officer positions, including for the UK Home Office and a number of other private and public sector organisations. So she's had a fantastic career. She's coming to talk to us. She's actually just released what is a fascinating book, which is really talking about how to create a culture in which employees thrive, if you like. So not completely irrelevant, I don't think, to what we were talking about just now in the last hour. So she is coming along to talk a bit about what she will say is her equation for effective leadership in the future, but really with a view to thinking about how employees thrive and what you can do with the organizational culture to facilitate that. So I hope to see some of you there, and I hope to see some of you at future webinars in the future. And otherwise, stay well, stay healthy, and have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.